Hello, sociology. We're talking about gender, sexuality, and age. All three of those topics could be sociology courses in and of themselves. But when we look at stratification, essentially we're talking about the layering of people in a society based on power, prestige, and property, or access to those things. So when you talk about gender, sex, and stratification, essentially, first of all, let's define terms. Sex refers to biological characteristics. Gender refers to social characteristics, and each culture defines gender in the sense that we have masculinities and femininities, different expressions. I oftentimes ask my students to take inventory of the gender socialization that they have received. So to be male means what? To be female means what? You received explicit messages about these as well as implicit messages. You could say that gender roles are both caught and taught. So those role models in your life, male and female, you take a look at their behavior, and that speaks to your socialization. And so each culture speaks to these gender values. We would inherit our sex really at fertilization. When a sperm cell and egg cell are united, at that moment, your chromosomes are determined. Most sociologists will emphasize gender and the environmental influence of gender. If you could say that sociologists believe that if biology was the compelling factor in human behavior, males and females would act the same around the world. But there's you would say there's subtle differences. However, sociologists can't deny the influence of biology, nor can they deny the import of the multifaceted dimension of gender identity and gender identity development. In terms of a medical accident, this speaks to the case of David Reimer. He was born an identical twin. His original name was the two boys, Bruce and Brian, the older of the two. In Canada in the 1960s, the medical doctor, instead of using a scalpel, used a cauterizing instrument and turned the machine too high and burnt his penis off. After several months of worrying and fearing the worst, the Reimers, Janet Reimer, the mother, along with the father, took counsel from John Money from Johns Hopkins University. Under his guidance, John Money was on the sociology side, even though he was a psychologist. He was on the nurture side, and he believed that if there was a complete medical castration, removal of the gonadal sex, gonads, and if the parents agreed to keep this a secret from the child, raising the child as a female, then then she would never know. The parents decided to take this option. The person that would become David Reimer was raised as Brenda. For the better part of 12 years, Brenda had a masculine gait, was made fun of for her broad shoulders, her masculine walk, for her aggressive actions towards classmates that would tease her. And she underwent very overly overt gender messages, such as girls play with dolls and you're a girl, therefore you play with dolls. At the age of 12, because she was having some pretty intense emotional and psychological problems, Janet Reimer and her husband took Brenda to a psychologist. The psychologist in counsel with the mother, recommended that Brenda be told the truth. She was told at this point she was receiving hormone therapy and had developed breasts. So at her adamant request, she received a double mastectomy. Hormones were stopped. She started taking testosterone, transitioned to a male, and lived out the rest of her life as David Reimer. David Reimer then had some difficulties, but was faithful in his work at a slaughterhouse. There was a book about his life, As Nature Made Him. This book was written by John Calipinto. David Reimer was married, had 3 stepkids, and eventually took his own life, 2008, I believe. And this is a sad story, but the question is, why did this intense gender socialization not work? Psychologists argued that perhaps gender identity and gender development is a matter of hormones. Vietnam veterans study looked at the testosterone level of Vietnam veterans. And the theory was that, as they found, Vietnam veterans had a higher level of testosterone. Prisoners have a higher level of testosterone. So the theory is that greater levels of testosterone account for violence and aggressive, and it is hormone levels that distinguish male and female. However, involved fathers, they also have very high levels of testosterone, those fathers who are most engaged. So this itself was confusing. So the answer is not, gender identity is not just a matter of biology. It's not just a matter of socialization, and it's not exclusively a matter of human choice. The question has to be one of yes to all of these, that we're actively choosing to receive gender socialization from our parents, to buy into that socialization, and our genetics do play a role. These are highly contentious, hotly debated topics. We do talk about gender identity dysphoria, formerly labeled gender identity disorder. We talk about this more in psychology specifically. But every society sorts men and women into separate groups and gives them different access to property, power, and prestige based on your sociology text. Females have long since been identified as a minority group simply because they make 68 cents to every dollar a man makes. This is now that we have women in the workforce at an equal rate to that of males. This has not really changed much, largely because there are more males at the top end of the career field. So they're making more because they're in management. If women ever take time out of work for their children, if they take a year or 2 or 3 off, we're finding that they have received what's called the baby penalty, meaning they have a harder time catching back up and out-earning males whenever they take an extended maternity leave, or if they get out of the workforce for an extended period of time. Men jump into the workforce and in advance. So in looking at what's identified as patriarchy, it's simply patriarchal societies are those in which men are dominant. Now, this theory is going to come straight out of Karl Marx. So Karl Marx worked with Frederick Engels in the Communist Manifesto. So this is, just so that you know this theory, this is coming from Marxist theory. So the conflict theory's perspective on this right? So the conflict perspective on society, and think of this as feminism 101. Early on, life expectancy was much less. Females oftentimes died in childbirth. To say females were limited by childbearing, basically what this meant was that their society depended on children. Society depended on women producing children, and therefore society depended on women to have as many children as possible. That was sort of their value to most societies. Men left the home to become dominant as hunters and warriors. Weapons and trade gave them power, so they came back with social capital and human capital. And Engels argues that this is how the idea developed that women were less dominant. In most societies, specifically if we take American society, the first wave of feminism argued that women needed the right to vote. So this was the suffrage movement. Feminism basically argued that biology was not destiny, as those such as Sigmund Freud had argued. Sigmund Freud in psychology even went so far as to argue personality was contingent upon sexuality, so that males, because they had external genitals, that they were extroverted always, and that if a man was not extroverted, if he was introverted, well, this was a product of faulty parenting by the mother. So he had received fixation, he was fixated at some point in his development. Conversely, women were meant to be nurturing because their gonads are internal, right? Their ovaries are inside. And so this idea of personality led to Freud to say that anatomy was destiny. So Karen Horney was a psychologist who argued this and was one of the first feminist psychologists. But other scholars began to argue this as well, and moving into the 1920s, and sociology took on this argument as well. So as you move late 1800s through 1900, the idea that women needed to vote, and without a vote, a woman was not recognized by the government as a person because she did not have the legal right to disagree with her husband. So the second wave of the feminist movement, after women earned the right to vote in 1920, then the more radical branch of the feminist movement sought for equal pay. And even beyond equal pay, the right to not be married, or the right to divorce and to not be hindered in society from this. With the feminist movement in the 1960s, we see women rush into the workplace and the fertility rate goes down. When women go into the workforce, this was really the most effective birth control, sociologists have said, because women simply didn't have time to manage children because they were working 40 hours a week. Feminist movement today is centering, among other things, plight of women in the least industrialized nations. It tackles human trafficking. It tackles sort of gender neutrality and gender fluidity. And if you're taking a look at where the argument of where this is centered, we can look at something such as gender inequality in education. So gender tracking is essentially the federal government now outlaws targeting gender in educational programs. So for instance, the Allied Health program in many of your schools kind of is like a pre-nursing technical degree, and welding would be like sort of a pre-welding high school technical degree. it was really outlawed for the government to sort of steer men into welding and women into nursing. The actual case is reversed. And when you find women going into welding or into business fields, engineering, etc., you see them going into male-dominated professions less. When men go into female-dominated professions, they actually climb to the top. So this is called the glass escalator. When men in historically female-dominated professions, they climb. Women in traditionally male-dominated fields hit a glass ceiling and have a difficult time reaching the very top levels of society. We've seen women die of heart disease at a higher rate than men, simply because the marketing campaigns, awareness campaigns of health in healthcare had not targeted women because they did not see that women were stressed. They did the stereotypical heart disease patient is type A, competitive, under a lot of stress, eating a lot of red meat and alcohol, and they pigeon-held men into that position. They basically, let's target men. And you could think of the medical community in the late 80s and 90s, they were not looking at women as being victims of stress and high stress work fields. And so during that window of time, many more women died of heart disease and were not screened out by the medical community. We are seeing that many times women were not represented in politics, and therefore policies that were of concern to many women weren't always put to the foreground. So we see the pay gap, women still making 68 cents to every dollar that a man makes. And we do take into account that you don't see women in high earning fields, such as law and medicine. When you look at the rate of women in the workforce, it really is preceded by changes in college enrollment. So we saw nearly 35% of women in college, 35% of those enrolled in college were women, whereas 65% of those enrolled in college were males. And if you found women in college in 1900, they probably would have been in women's colleges, studying things like nursing and education. It slowly climbs up until 1940, post-World War II. We had a great baby boom. Both of my parents were boomers, and I take great offense to my kids calling me boomer. They need to get their history and their sociology right. Chances are your parents are not boomers. If your parents were born in the late 70s and graduated high school in the 90s, they are Gen Xers. All right, let's get that straight. So the boomers were my parents, born after World War II, so born in between 40, 42, 44. Then you see a great spike in the population, and so therefore all of a sudden men are back in college after the war, women are home, and then we see a climb again. So now this climbs to the point 2010, more women getting college degrees than men. So the workforce is about 50-50 at this point. Perhaps the greatest case of inequality is that of sexual violence towards women. So 1 out of 1,000 US girls and women between the ages of 12 and 50 are raped every year. Most victims are known by their attackers. The older term we used to use was date rape. It's now acquaintance rape. Also, sexual violence is another term that is more acceptable because date rape kind of just connotes this idea that a woman was on a date. She had some level of consent just by choosing this person It led to all kinds of unhelpful questions, such as what was she wearing? Did she sort of send mixed messages? Those were all conversations that folks had in the 80s, and it really was, I think, misguided dialogue. That the impetus was oftentimes put on women to prove that they were not communicating desire for sexuality. So really the burden was on the victim in many cases when sexual assault did happen. So instead of proving no means no and proving that she communicated no loud enough, now the discussion has flipped, and that males are actually under the microscope more, because yes means yes, meaning that the accused has got to prove that he received consent from her. This happened in California, and it in many cases led to the Me Too movement, which is a large sexual assault awareness movement. Murder, men are more likely than women to be killers and to be the perpetrators of violence in the home. We do see structural barriers coming down and abandoning stereotypes and changes in relationships. And I think as a person who's worked in sexual violence intervention and prevention, I worked at a child advocacy center and dealt with many children as well as adolescents, males and females, but specifically females who were victims of sexual assault and rape. I did also deal with some males who were victimized by female teachers. We're starting to see an uptick in females, and unfortunately, one area in which women did not have the equal opportunity, now it seems they have the equal opportunity to be sexual offenders. It's very sad, but these messages of empowerment, I think, have and even this kind of sex positive culture that we have has led to an extreme of sex positivity, in the case that now teachers feel as though they have the right to express sexuality, so their females in positions of leadership have new illegitimate opportunities. And so we are seeing, in many cases, a reverse double standard. If a male teacher sexually assaults a female, he is seen as a pervert. If a female teacher sexually assaults her student, if she is deemed by society as attractive, such as the case of Deborah LaFave from 2004, 2008, there's been a couple of ex-NFL cheerleaders who have become teachers and they have sexually assaulted their students. Many people in society don't see these male students as victims. So it's a reverse double standard that in many cases has been brought on by a sex positive culture. So I'll be interested to find out your thoughts on this, and we'll go ahead and we'll stop this discussion, and I will divide these two into two separate discussion boards. Look forward to hearing what you have to say. Take care.